This podcast is a project of the Climate Designers Network.
Hey, this is Eric. Thanks for joining us on another inspiring episode of Climify that hopefully results in climate action in your life and work. We're still on track to bring you Season 4 of Climify in early summer of 2024. Think June-ish. There's a lot to do before then, but we have a great team here who are working hard to curate our theme, select our guests, and help tell a story that will lead to more climate victories. Today, we have a guest who I tried really hard to have on Season 3, but the timing just never worked out. Dr. Melinda Adams. She is a member of the San Carlos Apache tribe and an assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Atmospheric Science and Indigenous Studies at the University of Kansas. Most importantly, though, this discussion today would not have happened without our new producer, Cam Perkins. Cam, how are you?
Eric, hi. Thank you so much for having me. I'm doing great.
Yeah, thanks for all your hard work on this episode. You were tasked with a lot, researching Melinda, getting all the questions ready to go. You had some amazing questions. Can you talk a little bit more about how you did all that and what you're excited about in this episode?
Totally. So this is my first time producing a podcast of any kind, but I've always had a strong interest and investment in climate action, right? It's our shared future. It's our shared present. It's our shared earth. And so we do have a responsibility to steward what we have. And so I'm just really grateful for the opportunity to come here and sort of unearth stories that then will sort of inspire other people to be stewards over this planet. And so researching Melinda was a really, really great first foray into doing this work. She's an amazing scholar. She's got a fantastic journey that I'm really excited for all of you all to hear. Starting out at a tribal college and discussing sort of how having her scholarship steeped in her indigeneity has been transformed and grounded the way that she approaches scholarship now about fire and just sort of thinking about the earth as a relative, right? As us, as younger relatives of this planet, and things that we can learn from our more than human elders, as she called them. But yeah, the process really just involved sort of going through her body of work. Melinda has a lot of great research out that we will link for you in the show notes so that you can also expand your learning if you'd like to. And it's just really great to see an Indigenous scholar out in the world who is so steeped in who she is and who brings her whole self to her work. So I just sort of followed her on socials, her website, read her scholarship, went back to her socials and her website now that I had a little bit more of an understanding of her as an academic, to sort of then use that to round out my view of her as a person. And I just wrote the questions that I would have wanted to ask, not that Eric actually got to ask, right?
Yeah.
Who are you? Why do you do this? These are the things that I read that I didn't understand. Tell me more. So it was a really, really great experience.
I'm wondering what you're most looking forward to hearing about from her. For me, it was the more than human, and I'm thinking about, from a design perspective, human-centered design. So I like the idea of more than human-centered design. What were you most excited about hearing from Melinda?
Yeah, so in our work, Melinda uses these terms sort of interchangeably: ceremonial fire, humble fire, cultural fire. And all of these are words that I think those outside of fire action and scholarship would refer to as prescribed burns. So I'm very, very interested for you guys to understand, to learn what she thinks are the differences between these terms and these words and how they differ from sort of traditional methods.
Yes, me too. And for all of you listening, we hope you enjoy our discussion with Dr. Melinda Adams.
Well, thank you so much for having me. So as an Indigenous person, the way that we introduce ourselves and kind of show the families that we come from and honor the people that we're in relation to. So I would say Dagote, she Melinda Adams, Honshle. Hello, my name is Melinda. I belong to the San Carlos Apache tribe. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Kansas in the Department of Geography and Atmospheric Science, as well as the Indigenous Studies program. I am a cultural fire burner, and I am a learner, and I very much try to use research as a way to amplify and uplift my fellow Indigenous peoples in the realm of scholarship, but also the community-based research initiatives that surround it. I have a personal website that my students and I put together to amplify some of the ecological scholarship that's rooted in cultural ways of being. So that's scholarmelinda.com. And there's some pretty awesome cultural fire pictures that people can check out and learn more about our research initiatives and the community work that I do. And I also have my school webpage or my university webpage. That's geog.ku.edu/Melinda-Adams. That's my name. And the socials, which have been super helpful in connecting scholarship to action, scholarship to community interest. I am active on X or Twitter. The handle is Scholar Melinda. And I'm a little bit less active, but storytell through pictures on Instagram. And it's the same handle, Scholar Melinda.
Well, Melinda, it's amazing to finally get you on Climify. I think I may be in. When did I email you? I don't even remember. Like November of 2023. It means that you are in high demand and very busy, and honored that you found time to be with me today on the program.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I reviewed some of the previous guests that you've had on, some of which I'm fortunate to know. And so it seemed like a wonderful opportunity to not only talk about the things that I'm up to, the things that I'm doing, but also recognize, and uplift the community members that have gotten me here. So thank you for the invitation.
Oh, you're welcome. And I think you knew, or season 2's guest, Sadie Redwing. Is that true?
Amazing. Yeah. They met serendipitously while I was in California. Yeah. And they came through and were giving lectures on Indigenous graphic design, Indigenous art at a very known place for Indigenous media, Indigenous museum. So yeah, just so impressed with her as a scholar and the message that she has for our.
Me too.
Yeah. It's just, and then I listened to the podcast and y'all were talking about soils and I was like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
This is amazing. Yeah.
There's another episode besides hers where it was, I think it was in, which season was it? Maybe season 2 again, where it's what soil can teach graphic designers or what soil can teach designers.
I love that.
Yeah. Well,
it's a very great conversation to have to thread those things together.
Yeah, I agree. And you began your journey as an ecologist, an environmental scientist, and you were and I had not heard of this university, the Haskell Indian Nations University, and we did a little digging, and it's one of 37 universities serving Native American students. But your work now, it's still in ecology, but there's kind of an intersection, and I see in terms of, environmental science is still there, but into environmental policy and then Native American studies. And I was wondering what drew you to all this, and how did your educational landscape and cultural identity influence your trajectory now as an assistant professor?
Yeah, sure. So I appreciate that question and the digging to get to what exactly this person is and what kind of worldview they bring into this space. I did go to school at a tribal college, which now I've returned and I teach up the road from. And like within our communities, we understand how powerful these educational systems are because they are by and for Indigenous peoples. And so whereas other Indigenous students in STEM disciplines may not have had that interaction with their cultural identity or ways of being until much later in their academic career, I was grateful, and I'm fortunate to be able to have had that as my very first college experience. Like when I was 17 years old, I have a later birthday, going away to the Midwest to a tribal college, and not only learning Indigenous science from Indigenous peoples, I also got to learn about the 100 or so other different tribes that are in this space at the same time at this college. I was incredibly empowering for me in shaping my identity and always being an advocate for Indigenous peoples and our place within the academy. So, I mean, add on learning Indigenous science, it's already valid and already taught in a curriculum. And that really set me on the path to being a professor and doing this professionally, where I'm able to tune into or to attune to young Indigenous scholars and molding their scholarship and their research within and outside the fields of ecology. So that's my journey at Haskell. I'm so grateful for it and how it's built me for that. I guess it's welcomed me to think about these ecological systems more wholly, like more holistically, as opposed to segregated or siloed. So it's always been an interest of mine, and I'm assuming with landscape architecture or folks that are in design, like thinking about how do we learn from the land? How do we on the land? What tools do we have? But for us, we think about who's been here, what native peoples are these homelands, who do these homelands belong to? So I think there's opportunity within many fields of disciplines and even with allies and community members that want to learn about the places that they live. There's opportunity to learn about the Indigenous peoples who were once there and who continue to be there. So I think all of that molded together through my tribal college education has shaped the researcher that I am, and the tools, whether they're analytical or community-faced, the tools that I try to use in my work.
So you were talking about their education, and you're an educator. Was that experience at Haskell one where you decided, I need to teach more people about what you learned there at that school?
Definitely. The interesting part of Haskell, it being a cluster of these tribal colleges, which we think of as a way to exercise educational sovereignty as Native peoples. It's a school for us to go to pick up our 4-year degree while also having space to express ourselves culturally and some levels spiritually. But what makes Haskell unique is that it started as a boarding school. It started as a residential school, a tool of colonization that the government sanctioned and, Native children to, from my understanding, as far away as they could go from their families to sever, those cultural connections to the places that they are from, their language, their culture, their kin networks and relationships. So Haskell has a very interesting history of that being what its purpose was for in the world. So over time, and I'm have to speed through this, but over time, it's evolved from a tribal college to an industrial school, to a high school, to a junior college, and now currently it's a full-fledged university that offers baccalaureate degree programs. But always we remember, and you feel, that spiritual connection when you're on campus.
There's probably like the trauma still there, right? And the build, that energy, right?
Definitely. But I think included with the trauma is the empowerment of our people, they have transitioned it into a place of empowerment. So that was, again, a part of my educational journey. I'm 17 years old. So you can imagine being a young Native person, learning these things about yourself and about your identity, how hard that could be, but also how empowering that is now that I can look at it clear. So Haskell has that unique history to it. And when I talk about the fire work that I do, cultural fire and research with Indigenous communities, it's interesting, because that's what influences me and what I don't ever forget as a part of my worldview and the reason why I do this work.
But after that, you went to Purdue. You went to just like a couple hours from me in Indiana. You went to Purdue. Probably a very different experience for you. So I'm interested in that, and I'm interested in your work there on biochar, which something I'm familiar with because I was trying to use biochar in some of the papermaking work I was doing. But can you talk more about biochar and you described at the same time a cultural fire as an ancestral soil amendment, and how that's connected to your work in biochar and all of that stuff is really interesting to me.
Sure. So my journey was interesting because I was in such a rich environment as a young person finishing up my degree in environmental science at Haas School. And I, like many Native peoples who go on and do the thing and beat the 1% of graduation, I just was asking myself what it is that I wanted to do. So I think I had a lot of encouragement just telling me that I needed to go on for an advanced degree, a master's of science, a PhD. So at the time, there were folks that were getting a program for Native American students in the STEM disciplines for their master's of science, MS, and their PhD within the STEM field. They had just received funding from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, an amazing philanthropy organization that
Heard of it. It's good.
Yeah, that puts a lot of money into graduate degrees and undergraduate, I think, to an extent, for BIPOC, underrepresented communities. So we had people wanting to talk to us and wanting to do some recruitment for those of us that were getting our degrees in sciences and going on for more school and going on to graduate school. And so I eventually met my future advisor, and he taught in the ecology department at Purdue, and met with my mom. He knew how to use recruitment for Native families, met with my family, took us out, and kind of just built the assurance that I would be okay, academically, socially, and to an extent culturally, the best that they could offer, because we, when we're leaving our families, just the history of having to leave our families for our communities, I think they wanted to be more attentive to that.
Yeah.
So, I flew my family out. We got to see the campus. Yeah, I got to visit the more east part of the Midwest. So I ended up going and had a really tough time, just honestly. It was really transition going from a tribal college, 100% Native American students, that I always use this analogy that we were all Native, so we didn't necessarily have to say I'm Native. You just started off with I'm Melinda, I'm Apache, or, I don't know, Potawatomi.
True. Yeah, I didn't think it.
Yep. So now I was thinking about going to school at the time it was called, and I think it might still be, a predominantly white institution, a PWI, it's officially titled that.
PWI, that's one I never heard of before.
Yeah, PWI.
All right. I think I'm at a PWI then too.
I would imagine, yeah, Illinois. And that would be going into the College of Agriculture, so white, male-dominated type of curriculum and class makeup. So yeah, I didn't know these things at the time. Again, I was fairly young, graduated and going on to graduate school. So I had a tough time, honestly. Academically, coming from tribal college to a Research One institution, where I learned what that was. And I was like, oh my gosh, they invest how many dollars for STEM type of research?
A lot.
Yeah. So academically, I struggled. I can be honest now. And then culturally, not having cultural events to go to, or not seeing other Natives so readily as I would see them at the tribal college. And again, having to say, I'm Melinda, I'm Native, as opposed to saying, I'm Melinda, I'm Apache, getting
I see.
And those little things, they just, they wore. So I had a really tough time. I did a few lab rotations trying to center research on Indigenous ways of being. And it was, at the time, really hard to do. It was hard to find a person who would want to blend those types of learning experiences and to build research within a STEM discipline. So I had a tricky time. I had a a hard time. So I went to the lab whose person recruited me, and they encouraged me to kind of share my story with people that were my same age or people that might have been the incoming cohort, just to come from a place of honesty, but then to also, remind me of how important it is to be there and to research and get the degree and then go back home. So I ended up doing this research on biochar, which is a soil amendment that's found in the Amazon area of the world, and it's up to 200% more fertile, those soil plots, than there are in surrounding areas. And
Oh, I didn't know that.
yeah, those areas were purposefully burned by indigenous peoples for land tending and land care. And they didn't call it sustainable agriculture, but I'm thinking it's agriculture for plentiful crops, for high nutrient soils. So they're amongst the most fertile, which means they produce plentiful plant diversity. They're some of the most fertile stretches of soils in the entire world. So when my advisor showed me these and said, well, indigenous peoples created these soils, I was already intrigued.
Yeah.
I wanted to do research within this biochar realm. So I did, and we had some field experiments where we looked at different percentages and got really good results from the tallgrass prairie, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Up here in Illinois, yeah.
Had such an amazing ecosystem. I just came from California, but I can't talk about prairie enough and how beautiful it is and majestic, but also the cultural significance to the tribes in these areas. Like there's that interesting interface of prairie with large game, with indigenous peoples, and how they stewarded both of those things. So, and then for me, fire was a big role within the prairie bison indigenous peoples web. So yeah, we applied biochar to tallgrass prairie to try to restore some of those remnant prairie patches. And we had some pretty good results. It's one of those field trials where you need to keep returning to it and to keep the data. So it's still there in Indiana. And
your lasting legacy in West Lafayette.
West Lafayette.
Yeah.
It put some good indicators of soil health and soil amendments and potential for carbon storage. So that's kind of where I got started with soil amendments. And flash forward, I spent some time back here in the Midwest teaching as a professor at the tribal college that I... Yeah, full circle.
Full circle. Just like life, right? It's circular.
And then got the opportunity to study at one of the best Native American Studies degree programs in the United States. And so that was at Davis. And this culture of the return of Indigenous-led culture fire just intrigued me right when I was learning about it, when I was living in Davis, which is between San Francisco and Sacramento. So that's about 6 years ago, so you can imagine the momentum that is now, like what it looks like 6 years ago. So kind of being a part of it when it was at the not quite getting as much attention as it's getting right now. So the way that I was thinking about what my dissertation research could look like was I knew I wanted to work with fire just because I've had that previous experience. I knew I wanted to study ecologically what it could be doing to the landscape, what it could be doing to the ecosystems. And absolutely just learning that these are indigenous ways of being, kind of like storytelling on the land. I
love that.
That I already had in my mind what I wanted the research to look like. And I was fortunate to have mentors and people that worked with me to build this dissertation research. It's very interdisciplinary and hopefully speaks to some of the issues that California and the West is experiencing with fire currently.
Yeah, it's a big issue for sure, especially with climate the way that it is. And so let's talk about fire, because one of the main reasons I was super interested in your work, just to be kind of nerdy, like your website's really cool. And your first, I think it's on your homepage, or your homepage has you and there's fire, and it looks like you're kind of like a superhero walking away from like an explosion of a prairie fire, which is beautiful at the same time. And so you've spoken in your work a lot about this fire worldview as a recognition of fire as kin, which I really like, and shared by Indigenous peoples and others on the black line. And so I'm wondering if you can talk more about this black line and fire as kin, because I find that super interesting.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that. I just landed at the University of Kansas from California, and we typically burn in the wintertime in the West because of air permitting issues. It's safer to do at that time of the year as opposed to right before or after wildfire season, which tends to be in the summer. So it's really the only time we have, in my experience, to burn. So I got to the campus in January, and by March, I had invitations from folks wanting to do fire demonstrations for multiple different reasons. So I was just getting myself grounded, and the interest was high, which is good. We're amplifying Indigenous ways of being and the peoples that are here and doing the fire stewardship work with us. So yeah, that picture, my colleague Joey Orr captured some of those.
It's great.
He was telling me about just texting me on my way home, and it was already a long day, and I was like, oh, no, that's cool. And then he showed me, and I was like, oh, wow, that is a pretty good one. So I appreciate you taking the time to look at that.
Oh yeah, and you also have yourself as like a comic superhero on the site too, which I also really, as a comics guy, really like.
Right, that was just the opportunities that have found their way to me. I'm very grateful to be able to have those opportunities. So just a shout out to all the folks in the space they made for this Indigenous woman who does fire to be on their platforms. The comic was super cool because, I mean, going to your question about fire kin, the way that I've been educated about fire, just being in the fire world, a lot of people are afraid of it. A lot of have this knee-jerk reaction when you try to talk about putting fire to the ground. And this is coming from both where I'm at in the Midwest, where fire culture looks a little bit different. There's prescribed burning, there's farm burning, there's ranchers that burn. So it's not as knee-jerky. But in the West, just the sheer amount of people that have been directly affected by wildfire, displacement, homes lost, trauma that they've experienced, fire gets a really bad rap.
Yeah.
It really does. And there's multiple reasons for that. But for us as Indigenous peoples, the way that I have learned from those other than in my Apache community, fire's deeply related to a lot of us, a lot of Indigenous peoples. A lot of tribes in the West have stories about how they come from fire. They have stories about how fire is an integral part of their cultural identity. Some tribes identify as fire-dependent community, like their cultural ways of being. And then for us, like we have, at least in my lineage, in my family, we've always understood fire as a stewardship tool, like as a way to better the materials that we need for ceremony, for medicine, to grow subsistence foods. So we have a very different relationship than maybe a non-Native community member living in the now. It's, those historic tides and those cultural ways of being that are ingrained in a lot of our identities as Native people, it's different. So what I try to do with things like the comic and things like just showing pictures of fire stewardship, is trying to rebuild a relationship and a connection, both inter-specifically and intra-specific, individual and our communal relationship with fire, because fire's not going anywhere in our future. If anything, the change is telling us it's going to get worse.
It's going to be everywhere.
Yeah, so I appreciate those public face pieces that try to tell the story of fire in a different way, try to normalize it a little bit more rather than villainize it.
The word that comes to mind is regenerate. Is that something that you would also qualify as some uses of fire?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm talking to the person that lives in the prairie, right? So
Yeah, we burn prairie grass here.
quite heavily dependent on the physical and the chemical responses of fire to either trigger or regenerate growth for the next season or the next year.
Yeah.
Or in the West, when we burn in montane areas or savannas, that smoke from low intensity fire, it wards off problematic pests, or
Yeah, that's true.
it could be infesting on different ecosystems. This is more narrative, or this is more reflective, but I've worked with folks who have observed that post fire, when you have the ash on the ground, not only does that trigger plant responses, but you also see large game that wallow in it to try to remove some of the things that are on their fur. Like, there's so many benefits ecologically to fire that are understudied. It's an understudied field right now. But us as Indigenous peoples and people that pay attention to their ecosystems and know how many good things fire does, we're attuned to those regenerative properties that fire invites.
But there's some terms in that I've read through your work, and cultural fire is one, ceremonial fire, good fire, and one I believed you coined humble fire. Is that true? And they all come up in your work, and what if any are the distinctions between these types of burns, and do they speak to different practices, intentions, circumstances?
Yeah, no, I appreciate you kind of going over the different terms that are emerging and re-emerging in scholarship, one, but also when we work with agencies who are trying to have a balance between fire suppression and putting fire to the ground for a lot of the different ecosystem benefits that we just talked about. So cultural fire is, in my interpretation, some of the things that I write, it's Indigenous-led fire stewardship that are likened to prescribed or controlled burns for the benefit of cultural materials or cultural, social improvement, something that's bettering like our tribes and our communities, comparatively to prescribed or controlled burns. Those tend to be more agency identified. Some of the main goals in those types of fires are like wildfire mitigation or reduction in fuels. It's always about fuels reduction with those two types of burns. And that's not to say that those aren't still benefiting the ecosystem, but the goals of the two different types of burns, cultural fire, prescribed and control, that to me, in working with a number of practitioners and even myself, I mentioned the black line. Black line is the people that are burning with you, like you're on the burn. Yeah, so that's my interpretation of what cultural fire is, what prescribed and controlled is, how they differ. My mentor, the Honorable Chairman Ron Good, he is chairman of the North Fork Mono Tribe in kind of the Yosemite area, Mariposa, California. So he has gravitated towards the term ceremonial fire, which is another term I tend to use, because we can say cultural fire, which maybe signals ecological response. It's identity reclamation activities. But he specifically came up with and uses ceremonial fire. And I like that because he talks about the ecological benefits that are received when you purposely place fire as Indigenous peoples to these places. But he also equates that to a cultural and a spiritual healing that happens when you're tending the land in this way. So that's chairman's term that I like to use because it pulls back those layers of why it is we're doing what we're doing with those goals.
Yeah, you mentioned stewardship. And I think most Westerners, at least around the world, conflate stewardship with ownership. of the land. And I know in indigenous cultural practices, this is the opposite, or it's not, right? And your expertise, what is meant by that idea of stewardship in our land?
Yeah, and I tend to be a part of conversations where stewardship is conflated with management. And so,
That too, yeah, I hear that a lot.
so definitely this idea of ownership and how different that is from Indigenous worldviews. And right now I'm thinking of my colleague and an academic that I cite a lot is Dr. Dan Wildcat, who's a UG member. He wrote this really great book called Red Alert, Saving the Planet with Indigenous Knowledge.
Okay, I never heard of that one. And Melinda's holding it up. You can't see it, but it's what's on the cover there? That's like a scary cover.
Yeah, so the idea is like very kind of post-apocalyptic.
It looks like it.
Yeah, but like with Indigenous arts and culture, maybe signaling we need to listen to Indigenous knowledges if we're going to work through
Or to survive.
apocalypse.
Right, yeah. You got my attention.
I will say this book was written in 2008.
Oh.
And we're still like alerting a red alert, or we still have.
We're like in even redder alert right now.
I was thinking about to say that we still haven't paid enough attention
No.
to Indigenous peoples and saving the world with Indigenous knowledges. So in the face of climate change is kind of the message. So when I think about these ideas of ownership and management, scholars like Dr. Dan Wildcat and another scholar, Vine Deloria Jr., they talk about how there's those differences in worldviews, stewardship and what are we doing to live in balance with, I call them more than human relatives. I'm sure you've heard that on your show before too.
I haven't.
Oh, really? Oh, okay.
Oh, you know.
Okay. Well, other than human, so we think about our shared environment. It could be plants, animals, insects. So in our communities, we refer to them as other than human, or I use the term more than human.
Oh, I like that.
And I include fire
like
in there too. Yeah.
I do some paper making on the side, and I use native plants. And so I like to say I collaborate with plants. So I view them as well as more than human, maybe even better than human.
Well, you asked me before and I jumped around. I'll get to the point in a second. You asked me before and I jumped around a little bit about humble fire, like kind of this approach that I have with culture fire, Indigenous fire stewardship, and humble fire is what I use. And I meant to say that it's acknowledging that in a lot of our cultural histories, I've heard them termed by Melissa Nelson. She's an Anishinaabe scholar. She talks about original instructions, like those that have been handed down.
I have a book called that, Original Instruction. That's the one. And Melinda's holding up the book again. It's orange with original instructions.
Yeah. So these are lessons that have been transmitted to us, not necessarily written down, not necessarily in the English language, because a lot of the ways that we had to find our way back to these knowledge systems, they were purposely tried to be erased from our communities, taken away, suppressed. They tried putting us away. And so these are lessons that are homegrown from our communities. And so people like Melissa Nelson call them original instructions, stewardship lessons, right, that belong to a specific place. We call them place-specific lessons or stewardship tools. So very much Melissa Nelson, just shout out to
Melissa Nelson, everyone remember her name. Ashkenazi, you said, right? Ashkenazi?
Anishinaabe, yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah. Did I Anishinaabe, I'm sorry. Yeah, so that's, Anishinaabe have the 7 fires prophecy, correct? Are you from, can you talk about that a little bit? I know it's not necessarily Apache,
okay.
but I know it's not Apache, but I mean, I've read that prophecy in a number of different native and particular science fiction work. So, and I don't think I know enough about it.
Right. So all of this is very full circle because what I do with fire, it's, when I talk to fire agencies, it's not just the physicality of fire. And when I work with chairmen, we both try to say it's our cultural and spiritual connection to fire, not just for us, but for our allies, so that they can learn that this is a very close related part of who we are as Indigenous peoples. So this multi-layered approach to not just fire as ecology, not just fire as wildfire mitigation, and not just soils for carbon storage. I mean, all of that is interesting. But going back to my other pal, Dan Wildcat, he talks about removals and how climate change is another removal that Indigenous peoples are experiencing. We've experienced a geographic removal, when they moved us from our homelands purposefully, forcefully. We've experienced a social and a cultural removal from our kin networks that were taken away and separated and taken to boarding schools as far away as they could go. And so those cultural identity parts, the things that we would have otherwise have learned, the things that we would have otherwise learned, were taken when we were displaced, erased, attempted genocides. It's a hard, dark history.
I would call that an apocalypse.
That we need to talk about. Yeah, so there's people that talk about how we've experienced these removals. But to my interpretation, and I'm not an Anishinaabe, I know this from reading scholarship, what it tells us is, I'm trying to think of as eloquently how to put this, those parts of our histories and our ways of being, they were scattered, but they weren't destroyed, is kind of how a scholar interpreted it to me. So those pieces that were scattered, us, the younger generation, the seventh generation, finding our way back to them. So it's an eighth generation prophecy that's a fire of all things. It says that ancestors envision the eighth generation where those parts of ourselves that were taken are going to be returned.
So it's hopeful.
Yeah, it's a story, but also acknowledging why we need to find our way back to ourselves and our ways of being. So yeah, just the mixture of all those scholars and the stories that it's telling about hope, and Indigenous science.
You need that.
Being, I can geek out about these scholars.
I've said this a few times on this podcast and different episodes that I'm a big fan of the genre called hope punk, which is, I don't know if you've heard anything about it, but it's, the fight is worth it, right? You need to have hope, however small it may be, especially in times when you need to be resilient, right? That hope. I love that genre. And I do feel that Seven Prophecies is that. I feel like it is.
That's great. You knew about that and gave me the opportunity.
I read that book. It's on my shelf. But back to fire for a minute, and that it's a very cultural practice, as from my understanding of things. And there's a little bit of a trend, I would say, but I was thinking architecture is one where the term traditional ecological knowledge is used, or TEK. There's actually a book out about TEK and architecture, and in your work you talk about this, and so I'm interested in more about your thoughts and other Indigenous scholars' thoughts, Indigenous leaders, on moving away from that TEK term towards traditional ecological practices as kind of a more dynamic expression of Indigenous practice.
Yeah, so thanks so much for asking this question in particular. So I do have the article in Artemisia. It's a Native Plant Society journal, along with the Honorable Chairman Ron Good, whom is a mentor that I mentioned earlier in doing this fire work. So there's a small part of the article where I put a call out for kind of moving from traditional ecological knowledge, and we say knowledge is to kind of to signal that there's many, like trying to,
that makes sense,
tribes and different worldviews, different practices, but to move it towards, to actionize it to traditional ecological practices. So that's in the Artemisia article. So the reason why that came up in a lot of different conversations with not just fire stewards, but a lot of people that are working within this braiding of knowledges of TEK, traditional ecological knowledge. So on a high level, this is a conversation that's taking place in the White House. So there's an
That's good news.
Indigenous knowledge committee that's working on how to best implement traditional ecological knowledge, indigenous knowledge into agencies. So these are like under the DOI, Department of Interior, so Bureau of Land.
Deb Haaland, is she spearheading it?
I'm not sure her leadership role in this, but obviously as a DOI representative, I would imagine that she sees some of these
She's involved somehow.
I would imagine some capacity. So there's this dialogue right now and recommendations of knowledge holders on how to best incorporate indigenous knowledges, traditional ecological knowledge into agency branches.
Mm-hmm.
You can imagine the type of dialogue that's inviting amongst our communities and how people feel about it, especially when it's so place specific. So I'm imagining it's an incredibly nuanced conversation. It's good,
Sure.
to learn how to best work with tribes and actualizing traditional knowledges. But from my understanding, and this is me as a scholar and a person that works with agencies pretty regularly. So when we talk about TEK, a lot of times, oftentimes, it's regarded as a soft science. It's regarded as something that only lives in the humanities, or we can only look at from that type of lens. It's also thought of as being very static, like very standstill, very in the past. And kind of this naysay, well, we can't use TEK now because the environment's changed so much and the climate has changed so much over time. There's no way that TEK can work now the way that it did in the past. So it pasts us, like it relegates us to the past and not acknowledging like our knowledge systems are valid first and then are applicable, to the earth and to the environment. So my idea behind traditional ecological practices is that it signals a couple of things. First, it signals that you need the action behind the knowledges. We can theorize about indigenous knowledges all we want all day, but until you give us land or we have access to land to see how these knowledges are incorporated into land and water systems, that's really what the call is, the actionability behind it. It also signals who the decision maker is in invoking these practices, like in addition to the access to landscapes, where's the co-stewardship agreement or when can we return to show more knowledges played out on the landscape. So it does a couple of things in moving away from kind of this static and siloed interpretation of TEK. I just, in speaking with a lot of Native peoples and practitioners, it tends to be, well, sometimes it could be more harmful than helpful, like integrating TEK into the scientific work people are doing, the policy work that people are doing. So my idea, our collaborative idea in moving to traditional ecological practices is actualizing a lot of that, a lot of those avenues where knowledge isn't as forward-thinking.
That makes sense, because I guess when I was very hesitant about, I saw this book on Amazon, like this for designers on TEK, and I don't think it was written by an Indigenous person. And I was very hesitant about it because it felt like they were trying to teach me a formula, right? Like if you follow this formula, all of a sudden, this is, and I could be misinterpreting the book, so I don't want to knock the book here on the show, but I like the idea that there's action involved and there's context too, right? It's not just here's some knowledge, use it.
Yeah, and it also gets to the undergirding on some levels on a longer piece behind federal recognition. So that's another obstacle that a lot of tribes need to navigate or have navigated. So that talks about accessibility to Indigenous homelands or lands that you're trying to steward to. It doesn't say that full out when we talk about traditional ecological practices, but we can't have practices without knowledge. We can't have knowledges without practice. And that federal recognition, not having that government-to-government working relationship with agencies. If you don't have that, then you can't have access to land. So it tries to, the TEP, it tries to just storytell to readers about the nuances of those issues, like needing to better lands with fire stewardship or water care. This can be taken out of the context of fire as well if it's practices. Talks about like federal recognition and how that could be problematic if you don't have that recognition status. How do you be actionable if you don't have that government?
Yeah, that makes sense. We'll take a quick commercial break here and then get back to the conversation.
Hi, I'm Laura Hesse-Fisher from MIT. Do you want to get smart fast on climate change? Then listen to MIT's award-winning podcast, TIL Climate. In bite-sized 15-minute episodes, I partner with scientists and experts to walk you through climate change science and solutions, all without the jargon and without the politicking. Look for TIL Climate wherever you get your podcasts.
Where do young designers see themselves at the intersection of climate change and innovation, and how can we teach that intersection in the classroom? Designers are problem solvers, capable of imagining solutions for a more sustainable future. My name is Rachel Cifarelli, and I'm part of the Climate Designers New Wave team. In the past few years, New Wave has released 2 reports exploring students' experiences of climate design education, or lack thereof, and what they hope to see in their classes. Now we want you, design educators, to use this research in your classrooms, and this summer, we're giving educators a chance to talk to the New Wave team directly. Twice a month, the New Wave researchers will be available to walk you through our findings, answer any questions you have, and help you implement actionable project briefs directly into your classroom. We'll also show you how to use our media kit to easily share the research with your students and how they can sign up to be a participant. Head to climatedesigners.org/edu/newwave to sign up for a call with the New Wave team. Help us inform a new wave of design education, one that teaches every designer how to be a climate designer.
And there's another term that you, I think you came up with this term, and I really like it. It's Indigenous matriarchal ecologies.
Yeah.
That's you, right? Okay. Can you talk about that and what that is?
Yeah. Oh, so this one's very, very near to my heart, just because I think it speaks to a lot of the more recent work that I've done in the fire realm. So this was inspired by the Indigenous women fire practitioners that I worked very closely with in California. And it was one of my elders. She's an older woman, and she was very excited by a lot of the news pieces and media coverage that a lot of other Indigenous California tribes are receiving with their reclaiming of fire, because it was happening for so long in that part of the country, that part of the world. So she felt so good about that. But when she was reviewing who it was that they're talking to and who it was that are a part of these media pieces, she recognized that it was a lot of Indigenous men that were kind of telling this story.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
The matriarchy. We need the matriarchy. Yes.
So in just having a lot of long conversations with her and being a person that does the burning, not in all communities, but in a lot of communities, the men are the ones that are burning, but it's the women that have made the decisions long before we're out there. Went over where fire needs to be placed. And in some Indigenous cultures, ancestrally, women led with the fire, So in having these conversations with her, she wanted me to write a piece. She wanted me to write a piece that talked about maybe some of her leadership that she's done throughout her life, and really in this movement of returning cultural fire. And so I sat with it for a really long time and just listened and watched what was going on kind of within the fire world. And then I started having conversations with many different nations and how it's a lot of young women that are picking up fire and that are picking up and leading with fire. So I just felt so inspired to write something that acknowledges it. One, because I'm in the fire world, and from an agency standpoint, there's not a lot of, it's very underrepresented in terms of women that are in wildfire. It's pretty cut dry. It's white male dominated. So on one hand, I observed that, like being on the line and being in that reality. And on the other side, I noticed culturally, it's a lot of women, Native women, that are leaders in stewarding fire and reclaiming it and working on the line. So coupled with having conversations about what our societies looked like before colonization, learning about how this gender binary is something that is rooted in colonialism. Prior to colonization, it was our Native women that held the greatest power within our societies. That's why they're called matriarchal societies. And what that is that you take the name and you take the cultural identity of your mother. So, for example, I'm actually two tribes. So I'm like all Native. I'm half Apache and I'm half Tohono O'odham. And that's a tribe that's located in Arizona, southern Arizona. But because my Apache tribe is matriarchal, I take that of my mother's.
See,
so,
I see.
Yeah, so it does a few things, this matriarchal ecological knowledge. So there's the fire world aspect of it, like acknowledging women, Indigenous women fire leaders. It kind of recenters the leadership role within our Indigenous communities of Native women in fire placement, specifically with this cultural fire movement. And it also signals like how we used to make decisions as a society and maybe trying to reinvoke that Indigenous women's leadership in government and decision making and how we're transmitting intergenerational learning. Like, it's all in that article, but yeah, this firework gave a really great opportunity to talk about how powerful our Indigenous women are and how we have this inherited knowledges of a land, of a place, and we know how to take, as life givers, we know how to take care, in different ways than those that aren't Native matriarchs. I hope the article speaks to that as much as I hope it does, just with these long conversations.
Well, we'll link it in the show notes too.
I hope so. And as an ecologist, I mean, there's definitely women in ecology, but perhaps that's an invitation for more Indigenous women to be in the field of ecology and thinking about the systems that we think of in ecology in a more integrated way, in a way that reflects our cultural heritage and our identities as Native women. I hope it's a call for all of those things.
Yeah, and I think someone like Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is there, one of my idols, actually. I actually emailed her once. She didn't reply, but she's someone that I think is doing that through her work too.
Absolutely. Oh, the braiding sweetgrass.
That's the book.
I know a person that hasn't gravitated, that it spoke to them on some kind of level. And I definitely aspire to be similar to her work with plants. I think I aspire to be that way in my work with fire.
Yeah, for sure. And, when this past season of Climify began, just looking, I was on LinkedIn and I was looking around these different climate solution sectors there. And the most interesting work was done by women that I found. And so that's how this season came to be, was that, right? And just from like the design audience that I have, there's a conference called, I think, the 3% conference. And it's like 3% of design leaders are women. And though like 70 to 80% of the discipline is women. So it's dominated by white men. So I feel like there's much of my listeners are women and they can relate to your story.
I hope so. I'm also inspired by Kyle Pallas White, who's a Potawatomi scholar at the University of Michigan. So they talk about like
my alma mater, University of Michigan.
Oh, awesome. Just represented here.
Yes.
They talk about like a gendered lens of climate science, like Indigenous climate.
Interesting.
So definitely trying to uplift the perspective of Native women from like an allied type of approach. And then as it was brought to my attention, sometimes I talk about environmental justice, but if you think about the Dakota Access Pipeline movement, the Line 3 movement, the Idle No More movement, a lot of those on the ground advocates are led by Native women. So really wanting to recognize that, and people that may not be in our communities or know much about our communities, like just know that Indigenous women are the backbones of our communities, and advocacy of bettering our generations for the next 7 generations, certainly within the climate conversations. And fire, as we're learning, is very much a part of that Indigenous women.
Yeah. Well, to your comment about Robin Wall Kimmerer, you inspired me, and that's why you're here today. So I think you're well on your way to being that kind of leader. One of my fears for this show was that with the questions, I think before we started recording, I told you that there were some questions that we cut out because they were whole episodes in of itself, I think, if you tried to answer it. And in good news for our listeners, we will be having a follow-up program with Melinda and my producer, Cam, talking through some of these. And I don't know when that's going to happen, but it's going to happen when Melinda's free again. But we're coming up to my last question, and it's my favorite one that I ask every guest, and that is, you're an educator, so you're just switching over to the design classroom, okay? And if you were teaching a class to these young designers who are helping to make and shape the world, what would you assign them to do?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm a heavily visual person. Like, I think that's
we are too. Perfect.
I think that's why I appreciate the imagery of like good fire stewardship, because maybe I just don't look at the flames. Like maybe I'm looking around me and the natural world, and just on a deeper level, that's why I got into being an ecologist, environmental scientist, is that learning on the land. Oh, another scholar for you. Her name's Leanne Simpson. She talks about land pedagogy. So
interesting.
Yeah, so if I have the freedom to bring students out and have them experience like maybe the world through an Indigenous lens, like maybe we're outside when it's nice, when ephemerals are coming out, like that last bit of frost of snow, going into the springtime, seeing those showy flowers, I think. And part of the humble fire or humility approach that I have is very much in tune with where on the life cycle here of plants and animals and beings and humans, we're the younger sibling. Like we're the ones with the most to learn. So I think learning our place within that higher teaching modality is key. So I'm a believer in students that are at least taking my classes learn the best on the land. So you're learning that relationship and responsibility that you have to a place. When you're learning about, I've written about this in an article too, so just a shout out to the elders that helped me conceptualize this. You learn about homeland ecologies. So Indigenous stewardship lessons specific to a place, because like you said earlier, we can't take these lessons from one area and apply them to another and expect the same outcome.
Right.
It's a little creative. That's a little bit not living within the realm of trying to be a good human, a good relative. So for me, I'm inspired by Leanne Simpson's work, Land as Pedagogy. And maybe just thinking about those homeland ecologies, like who are the indigenous peoples whose lands this belongs to? What does it look like? And from an intersectional lens, an exercise that I try to lead students, native and allied, through, artists and non-artists alike, however the brain moves, is what would the world look like, if it were decolonized, if
There you go. There's the assignment right there.
some parts of it weren't taken away or as inhibited, what would it look like? So I think there's something in there for everyone, both the allied scholars who had this reckoning in 2020 and are trying to relearn or unlearn some things,
Unlearn, I think.
Yeah, being inspired by the land and listening to what it's telling us. And because we're all in a climate moment, humans and more than human relatives. So having that space and gentle guidance and bringing those connections together, I'm a fan of always learning on the land as opposed to in a classroom. So that's how I
need to do that more.
Being on the land?
Yeah, with my students. I talk about climate and the world, and we're in a white room. It's hard to...
No windows.
Yeah. I mean, literally it's white. So, the walls, floor.
I'm a person that knows the statistics about climate change and how my peoples and peoples that look like me are going to be disenfranchised the most. But that doesn't mean we can't hang on, just like my ancestors did, hang on to those threads of hope and those moments of darkness. That's what I inspire younger people, which in another article we talk about climate grief, cultural to mitigate climate grief. I like to think I'm that kind of professor that inspires the hope for those that are faced with the gravity of climate change.
This has been a beautiful conversation, Melinda. And before we go, I'd love to remind our listeners again, where can we find you online?
Sure. So I am at the University of Kansas. That's geog.ku.edu/Melinda-Adams. Or if it's easier, you can find me on X at Scholar Melinda.
Wonderful. Well, it was really great having you on Climify, and I look forward to the next time you're on Climify in one of our special episodes.
I appreciate that, you and Cam. So in our way, we say Ashan. That means all good things. Thank you.
Ashan. Climify is produced by Cam Birkins. Editing help by me. Designed by Ellen Keith Shaw and Christine Pilot. And a big thanks to Mark O'Brien and Natalie Walsh at the Climate Designers, who always support our efforts. If you want to hear more Indigenous voices from the Climify catalog, you can check out 2 of our older episodes. Katie Kamehameha from Season 3, Episode 13, and Sadie Redwing from Season 2, Episode 4. You can find design prompts and more information on all our guests this season at climatedesigners.org/edu/Climify, and on Instagram and LinkedIn at Climify Podcast. If you enjoy the work we all do here and you have a spare minute or two, we would truly appreciate it if you left a rating and review over at Apple Podcasts. The more folks that review our program, the higher the algorithm pushes up us in the search results. And in turn, the more likely we all can learn how to become climate designers. Hey, so Cam, what's coming up on our next episode?
So we are working really hard to bring you Season 4 of Climify, and our theme for this season is Change the System. So we will be interviewing guests who are changing the system as they define it, which is a really exciting thing for this season. We're going to ask each guest to tell us exactly what they mean by the system, what it means for them, and then to talk about how their work is changing that system. We're looking at 3 sort of levels, so commercial, the day-to-day, and the government. And we'll be going on a deep dive into each of these sort of 3 realms to learn how our guests, our experts, are influencing these spaces and how you can learn how to influence them yourself and make changes in your own life.
Well, when can we share the guest lineups and the new branding? because inquiring minds want to know.
We are working really hard to get that to you as soon as we possibly can. We're thinking early Junus for the start of the show, so be on the lookout in the next couple of months for some new exciting visuals and the guest lineup. So you can put it on your calendar to start counting down with it.
Yeah, I'm excited about it. I don't even know who the guests are yet, and we are working really hard on all of that. So thanks, Cam, for all your hard work.